Hello, and welcome to This Civic Moment, a special Meet the Leader speaker series. My name is Genesis Steele, and I'm the coordinator for Civic Engagement Program for the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement. And we are thrilled that you are joining us today for our special Meet the Leader series. We are so delighted that each of you have joined us today, and we'd like to thank you as our very important guests that are here. And we'd also like to take a moment to thank the Gephardt Institute staff for being with us, for which this presentation would not be possible for. And we would also like to thank the members of our National Council for joining us today. Thank you so much to John Berline, to Laura Kleinhandler, and to Claude Marks. So we're going to take a minute and share the agenda for today's presentation with you. And today we'll be sharing with you more information about the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement. We'll be sharing more with you also about the Meet the Leader series. We will be then going to our remarks by our featured speaker, Ms. Shaina Goodman, and then we'll follow that with a question and answer session. As a participant in today's presentation, we do want you to know that it will be a recorded session, and the recording will be made available publicly following the event. We encourage you to keep your video up and your mute on so that our speaker can engage with you during her remarks without interruptions. We encourage comments to be respectful, and we ask that there are no personal attacks, obscenity, profanity, selling of commercial products, endorsements for political candidates, and we do reserve the right to remove any appropriate comments. Also, when we move to our question and answer session, please know that we will be utilizing our chat room for questions. So we do encourage you to use the chat room for questions for our featured speaker, Ms. Shaina Goodman. A little bit about the Gephardt Institute. The Gephardt Institute fosters a culture of civic and community engagement at Washington University. We do this by catalyzing our community engaged citizenship, scholarship, and partners that advance the collective good. Our goals are to educate students for lifelong engaged citizenship. We also want to catalyze community partnerships that are responsive to community needs, and we look to infuse civic engagement throughout the WashU experience. Our Meet the Leaders series initially started as an intimate opportunity for students, staff, faculty to connect with our civic leaders across a variety of fields. In the light of the COVID-19 global pandemic, communities have changed significantly, calling us to examine our civic responses as individuals and institutions in new ways. Through This Civic Moment, a special Meet the Leader series, using our Meet the Leader model, we ask that our invited speakers focus on their area of expertise through the lens of COVID and one or more of our Gephardt Institute values, which include inquiry, empathy, collaboration, integrity, equity, and action. All right, and a little bit about our featured speaker. We are going to be joined today by WashU alumnus, Ms. Shaina Goodman, as our featured speaker. Shaina is the Director of Policy for Reproductive Health and Rights at the National Partnership for Women and Families. She manages policy and legal work on reproductive health, rights, and justice issues, including federal and state policy on abortion coverage and access, contraception, and other sexual and reproductive health issues. She also provides strategic policy and technical assistance to policymakers, researchers, and advocates, and collaborates across national partnership program to holistically address the barriers that women face and advance proactive and comprehensive policy solutions. Shaina's prior experiences have focused on issues of gender-based violence, including the intersection of domestic violence and family policy, economic justice, housing, and public benefits. She also deeply engages in work related to social justice and movement building, and is the trained dialogue facilitator. Shaina received her JD, Master's in Social Work, and Bachelor's degree in Women and Gender Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. While at WashU, she was involved in residential life, dance, marathon, WashU Dance Theater. She now resides in Washington, D.C., where her favorite things to do include baking and anything at the Kennedy Center and watching her young son discover the world. And without further ado, I present to you today our featured speaker, Ms. Shaina Goodman.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here and joining me today. Thanks so much to the Gephardt Institute staff for reaching out and inviting me to be a part of this series. I want to apologize in advance. I seem to be having internet issues today and I keep getting kicked out of Zoom, but I am dialed in separately on the phone. So if for some reason my face disappears, I'm still here and I will try to get back on video as quickly as I possibly can. So the first thing that the Gephardt Institute folks asked me to share with you is a little bit about my pathway to civic engagement. So I'll do that briefly, and then I'll shift to talking specifically about what we're learning about COVID and the particular implications that it's having for women. And feel free to engage in the chat box with questions. I'm really excited to hear from all of you and have this be a dialogue as well. So my pathway towards civic engagement really started with a class that I took as a sophomore at WashU that piqued my interest specifically in domestic violence. And I was drawn to that issue because not only of how deeply and pervasively domestic violence impacts women's lives, but also because I saw it as so interconnected to other things that I care about. Things like access to housing and economic security, health, education, kids' well-being, the law, so much more. So once I developed this passion for that issue, I started to really pursue other ways of exploring it in more depth. And I sought out policy or internships on policy and advocacy at the federal and state levels. I did direct services work. I worked at a transitional housing program in St. Louis. I worked in a courthouse in DC and in St. Louis as well, really trying to explore all the different facets of what domestic violence responses and advocacy looks like and figuring out where I fit best in that world. And that exploration ultimately led me to law school, which was how I ultimately felt that I could best utilize my skill set to be most impactful. And my initial thinking when I thought, oh yeah, law school seems like the right fit for me, was that I wanted to practice in court and advocate on behalf of survivors of domestic violence, help them get things like restraining orders or advocate for their housing rights. There's something really kind of nitty-gritty on the ground. And I saw doing that as a way to, obviously make a difference in individuals' lives, but then also saw the way that law could be used as a vehicle for broader social change. So I started law school, and to be totally transparent, about 6 weeks in, I thought, this doesn't feel totally right, because initially my law school education was sort of framed as though the law is a neutral thing that just sort of plays out objectively in people's lives. And to me, I thought that doesn't feel right. I think there's a social justice component that seems really missing here. And so I sought out the dual degree program at WashU with the social work school, which lucky for me, WashU has both a phenomenal law school and social work school, and I was able to combine those programs in a way that really made a lot of sense for me. It turns out that I later found classes and professors at the law school that really did teach the law with that social justice perspective. But for me, the dual degree was just really wonderful and allowed me to have an academic and educational experience that really set me up so well for the work that I was evolving to do more of and that I do now, which is on the policy and advocacy side of things. For me, I think that transition from my interest in direct services to thinking more about policy was really about scale of change. And I love the problem solving part of policy work and the messaging and sort of big picture strategic thinking that I wasn't getting as much of when I was in the direct services world, but really found a lot of in the policy and advocacy space. So basically now I'm a professional civic engager in my role as a policy advocate. And my career since finishing graduate school has taken a number of different forms. I started doing, in the domestic violence field, I started doing a lot of Hill advocacy, lobbying Congress, the House and the Senate for legislative and appropriations changes, really like in the weeds on bills and that sort of that world of policy work. And then I did more administrative policy, so working with the White House and federal agencies to develop stronger responses to meet the needs of domestic violence survivors, because there's a whole host of things that happen through the administration that aren't law or legislation that impact people's lives, things like regulations and sub-regulatory guidance, and a lot of policy gets made through the administration. So I did that for a number of years, and now I do kind of a little bit of both, and also what some people have described to me as like think tank policy work, which is really the work of stepping back, analyzing, assessing a situation or a problem or an issue, and thinking through strategically what are the solutions, how do we develop a framework for a policy proposal, how do we then communicate that to policymakers or the public or other stakeholders in a way that moves the needle on an issue. So that's sort of in a nutshell what my civic engagement work looks like. And I think, what's so interesting to me, I think, is that people often don't realize the full extent of the work of policy advocates and what goes on behind the scenes to shape issues and policy. I think when we hear the word lobbyist, we often think about corporate lobbyists and special interests, but there are good folks in the room also who, might be fairly classified as lobbyists, but don't really fit that stereotype. And we're also in the room trying to influence policy based on our experiences working directly with the people most impacted by the issues that we care about. And so that's the work that I do now. And I work, so specifically I work now on issues of reproductive health and rights, abortion access, contraception, sexual and reproductive health education. But one of the things I love about the work that I do, like what initially sparked my interest in domestic violence, is that it's a really intersectional issue. Reproductive health is also about maternal health care and work-family issues and economic security and a whole range of things. So I do get to continue to kind of have that broad intersectional analysis in my work and in my thinking, and that's one of the things I love most about this work. Okay, I seem to have lost Zoom. Maybe it's coming back. Anyway, I will just keep talking. I apologize that I can't see you all right now. So let me transition now to talking a little bit about the current COVID crisis and what we at the federal policy level and in the work that I do specifically are thinking about and are starting to understand and uncover. So we say all the time now that this is a crisis within a crisis. And what I think this has done has laid bare just how many things were wrong structurally, like at this fundamental level in our society. And those of us that work on issues like women's healthcare, like healthcare writ large, like economic security, understood that things were kind of, fundamentally broken in a lot of important ways. But now it's been so clearly amplified, not just for us that do this work on a day-to-day basis, but it feels like for the public, I think people are seeing more clearly now the challenges and the barriers that folks face in their day-to-day lives. So in my world, some ways that looks are, sorry, I'm trying to simultaneously log back into Zoom and talk. Here we go. Here. Okay. Hi, I can see you all again. So most obviously, I think paid sick days is an issue where we're really seeing that what the lack of access for folks to paid sick days has looked like. So we know that the most recent data that we have right before the coronavirus crisis is that about 34 million workers in the United States lack paid sick days. And those 34 million people are disproportionately women, and they're disproportionately women of color, particularly Latinx and Native American folks. And people working in low-wage workplaces, think places like retail, restaurants, domestic and home care workers. Those are the folks that also disproportionately don't have access to paid sick days. And those are also professions that are much more likely to be dominated by women and women of color. And think about who's been deemed an essential worker now. So it's nurses, folks that are working in the healthcare system, in the cafeterias and in the janitorial staff. It's the farm workers that grow our food. It's grocery store workers. It's home care workers that are providing care in places like nursing homes or in residential settings. Like, those are the people who don't have the structural supports like paid sick days to take care of themselves and their families. And they also don't have the luxury right now of not going to work. So they're putting themselves and their families in vulnerable positions without the backing of the policies that we need to enable folks to have economic security. And the first COVID response legislation tried to provide some paid sick days to those folks, and covered a lot of people that weren't previously covered, but that legislation has not closed all the gaps or reached the workers that need it most. Another thing that has been laid bare by this coronavirus crisis is just how disparate our healthcare system and healthcare outcomes are for folks. We're seeing all of those disparities that already existed just exacerbated exponentially. My colleagues on my organization are some of the leaders in the maternal health space and have been talking for years now about the maternal mortality and morbidity crisis and the disproportionate impact that has on Black and Native women. And now we're seeing just how much harder still it is to get adequate prenatal care right now. Or we were talking in our office the other week about what must it be like to be forced to labor alone without an advocate in the room there with you, without your partner in the room there with you. And we know that for Black women in particular, one facet of the maternal health crisis is the implicit bias and sexism and racism that determines the quality of care that they get. So if a Black woman is now in a hospital laboring alone and doesn't have an advocate to help make sure that there are those checks against that implicit bias that crops up, I mean, the quality of her labor and delivery experience is at best, not what she would hope, and at worst, fatal. So we're seeing that, that maternal health crisis exacerbated. As we learn more and more about, who's getting sick from the virus, who's dying. Again, we're seeing a disproportionate number of Black people and other people of color who are getting sick and dying. And I think that's revealing, again, like there are these underlying social determinants of health and structural issues that we know create healthcare disparities, and we're just seeing this crisis compounding all of those disparities. So social determinants of health being things like who lives in safe housing, or whose community is near or far away from environmental toxins, or what's the access to healthy food look like in your neighborhood and in your community? Do you have access to quality healthcare providers in your neighborhood? Whose symptoms and needs are taken seriously by the medical establishment? All of these problems that were, kind of humming along in the background, and some folks were paying significant attention to them. And maybe we were starting to make progress on some of addressing some of those barriers and challenges, but now the gap is just like exploding again, and we're having to contend with that. In my work specifically in the area of reproductive health care and abortion care, I think we know that abortion care has long been political and politicized, but we're seeing now, again, just how political that issue can get. We have been talking in the reproductive health rights and justice movement a long time about post-Roe, meaning post-Roe versus Wade world, and what it might look like if or when the Supreme Court overrules Roe v. Wade. And we know currently, actually, that many people, and particularly women of color, are already living functionally in like a post-Roe world where abortion access might be a legal right, but for practical purposes, it's just not accessible, and contraception is barely accessible. There are, big swaths of the country that are contraceptive deserts where folks don't have access to adequate providers and care. But now we're seeing states actually say that abortion is not essential health care. States are trying to make it illegal to access abortion care for the duration of the COVID crisis while there are stay-at-home orders in place. And we're seeing now that this legal right very much depends on judges. Take, for example, what's happened in Texas. I don't know if some of you all have been following, but over the course of a handful of days, abortion went from being illegal in the state of Texas for the first time since Roe v. Wade to being permitted in some very narrow circumstances, and then back and forth again, as court orders moved up and down the court system, as the governor basically changed his mind and changed it back and then changed it back again. So reproductive health care is tenuous already, and is even more so now. So again, just to like put a really fine point on it, I think what we're seeing is that all of these gaps in our system, all of these things that structurally folks need to be healthy, be safe, have some economic security, they're maybe more precarious than we thought they were. And we're seeing just how critical it is. These aren't problems that can be solved by individuals or families. These are big problems where a lack of policy and systemic and government structural supports really make the difference for folks. So now I think it's on us to decide, as we emerge from this crisis, do we want to go back to things as normal as they were before, or do we want to demand a new normal that's based on what we now know really deeply to be true about what people need? So I will stop there, and happy to open it up for Q&A.
Let's see, how about we start with a question that was submitted from one of our students. Let's see, I'm not sure if she's with us today, but if Candace Hayes is here, go ahead and unmute yourself for a couple of the questions that you submitted prior to today's meeting. All right, and if she's not here, one of the questions she had for you was, do you know, I'm sorry, do you know of any updates regarding the impending release of Title IX regulations?
Sure. So the Title IX regulations have to do, among other things, with campus sexual assault. I know it's an issue that a lot of folks at WashU have been engaged on. So the final rule has cleared OMB, the Office for Management and Budget, which basically has like the final stamp on federal regulations, meaning, so now that it's cleared through OMB, the final regulation could be released any day at this point. Advocates are doing their best to try and suss out when that might be, and we don't really have an idea of exact timing. This administration tends to try and drop rules late in the day on Friday. So could be today, could be next week, could be months from now. But technically the rule is like ready to be released at any point in time now.
All right. And for those that do have questions, don't forget to type in your question into the chat room, and we will work with the questions as they come in. Another question that was pre-submitted for you, let's see, Melissa Ruthwich. She said, please share any advice for current undergraduate students, graduate or professional students, specifically interested in continuing their work on sexual health education advocacy after graduation.
Sure. My first piece of advice is we need you. Please stay engaged on these issues. I think the most important thing, and I would say this is true across the board in terms of issues that folks might want to work on at an advocacy level, is make sure you have a good understanding of the federal and state policy landscape that impacts sexual health education and how progressive legislative policy proposals would make a difference. And then the flip side of that is stay connected to the people most directly impacted by the issue. So in this case, young people, like talk to them about what they want and need, get an understanding for how they process information, what they prioritize, how they think about topics related to sexual health. Because I think what I see often is that people who do more of the direct service on the groundwork are often very disconnected from the law and policy, and vice versa. People that spend a lot of time in the policy world forget or never really had a direct connection to folks on the ground. And it's so important to have an understanding of both worlds and what happens in both spaces. And you know, there are some great resources out there on sexual health education and advocacy. A couple organizations that are my go-to places are SECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change, an organization called URGE, Unite for Gender and Reproductive Equity, and then Advocates for Youth. There are some really great organizations that all approach sexual health education with like an equity and social justice framework. And they do a really, really good job of centering youth in their work. So if you're interested in those topics, I would highly encourage you to check out those organizations because they do really wonderful work.
Wonderful, thank you. Great answer to that question. Looks like we've got a couple of questions that are in the queue. So we will go with, let's see, David Israel. All right, if you're here, go ahead and unmute yourself. I believe you had a question for a speaker. And we'll follow David with Priya, and then Carl, and then Keishi.
Good afternoon, morning. Depends on where you are, I suppose. I don't remember what my exact question was, but it was something to the effect of what can we be doing now as sort of in this current scenario on a local level to be helping out?
Yeah, hi, David. Thanks for the question. I think, you know, there's an election coming up, and despite all of this, I know that November feels like kind of impossibly far away, but it is really important to really like ramp up voter engagement right now. I don't think folks are doing door knocking per se, but I think if, you know, on this issue, on reproductive health policy, on healthcare, on a whole host of issues that folks care about, local campaigns and candidates I think are trying to figure out how to engage folks in their communities right now in this new way, whether that's through phone banks or text banks, or things like that. So I would encourage you and other folks to, you know, reach out to the campaigns or candidates in your community and ask how you can help engage with voters. We know that healthcare specifically is a major motivating issue among voters, and I would have to imagine that that's even more true right now. And we can really persuasively help engage voters around the importance of folks' ability to access the healthcare that they need when they need it. So yeah, that's my first piece of advice on that.
All right, let's go with Priya next. And I'm going to make a correction. I incorrectly said a name. Mr. Marks will go after Priya, and then Keishi, and then we'll take a question here from Shannon Boyer.
Hi, I don't quite remember what my question was. I think I had a few, and one of them was about something you had already answered. So if you want to ask my question, it's totally fine. Otherwise, we can keep going on.
All right, so Priya's question was, what does your typical day look like, and how has your life been impacted by COVID-19?
Sure. So my day-to-day work is a lot less glamorous than lobbying sounds. It's a lot of conference calls and video calls these days, and a lot of writing. So I think, as I said earlier, like I'm always trying to understand and assess the impact that an existing policy or a new policy proposal will have on people's lives, or identify an issue that people are grappling with and figuring out how to translate that into a policy solution. So it's a lot of back and forth with impacted folks, with colleagues, with other smart people in the advocacy community, with other stakeholders, with policymakers, to sort of test out ideas and think together creatively and strategically. And then once we've got our brains wrapped around something, I do a lot of writing. So like fact sheets, issue briefs, talking points, all kinds of materials. In terms of how my life has been impacted by this, I mean, certainly my work has changed. We've all pivoted to addressing the impact that I was talking about earlier and put a lot of our other projects and things on hold. Other than that, like I have a lot of privilege and I'm super fortunate. So in the scheme of things, like the impact on my day-to-day life has been really minimal. My husband and I both have jobs where we can work from home, where we've got a roof over our head, we can get groceries delivered to us. We're, you know, very lucky, which isn't to say that I've certainly had days where I feel very like anxious and challenged by this new reality, as I'm sure all of us do. The biggest challenge that we face is I've got a 7-month-old baby. So trying to juggle full-time work and being a full-time childcare provider is a lot, but we're, you know, healthy and safe and all the things that really matter. So it's all good.
All right, thank you to Priya for her questions. Next, we'll go with Mr. Marks. Mr. Marks, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, it's Claude. Hey, Shaina, I enjoyed your talk very much. I had a quick question for you. In terms of the language that is often used in these debates, previously President Clinton and others talked about wanting abortion to be safe, legal, and rare, but you don't hear that phraseology very much anymore. Do you know why that has changed?
Sure. I think because we want it to be more than safe, legal, and rare. I think that was operating from an assumption that abortion was, I'm trying to be as articulate as I can here, like a bad thing that had a lot of stigma and shame attached to it, and that people, you know, should only be available to people in the most dire or sort of like worst case scenarios. And what we know now is that abortion is fundamental to people's dignity and equality and health, for sure, and economic security. And yes, of course, we want it to be legal, and of course, we want it to be safe. And the reality is that abortion is incredibly safe. Medication abortion, for example, is safer than taking Tylenol. So it's, you know, it's just, I think, a shift in our thinking as advocates and as a movement about, you know, understanding the role that not just abortion, but also reproductive health care writ large plays in people's lives, and trying to destigmatize it and really normalize it as the basic health care that it is, and that all people should have access to, regardless of the reasons why they might need it or want it.
Thanks. Good answer.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Our next question comes from Casey Fakey.
Hi, sorry, my dad is like sawing things in the background, so if there's noise, I'm sorry. Yeah, you kind of answered my question already, but I guess my main question, also my dog is barking, chaos, was like how you stay connected to like local communities and like direct service work when working for like a large scale national organization.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things, especially about being in DC, is people often come to DC to do federal work and forget that DC is also a local community, and there's a lot here. So I think, you know, a great way to stay engaged is like find a local community organization that maybe, you know, it's okay to have some separation from your like 9 to 5 job and then like the volunteer work that you do. So maybe if you work on housing policy as part of your job, don't volunteer for a housing organization, but find something that's like relevant, but maybe more tangentially related in your community, and spend some time at that organization with those folks. Make sure you have an understanding of what's going on the ground, so that you kind of do keep a foot in that door. And if you're lucky, you know, the organization that you work for at a national level or at a state level will have some process as part of their work to keep the policy advocates connected to the direct services work. And if they don't, that's something that you as an advocate within your organization can push for. So whether that's like doing focus groups or surveys, kind of always checking the policy back up against the quote unquote real people whose lives are going to be impacted by it.
Thank you.
All right, our next question comes from, I believe, Shannon Boyer. Shannon, go ahead and unmute yourself and share your question with us.
Sure. So my question was, how can reproductive justice policy work be more inclusive of trans and non-binary folks, and if there are any trends that are going in that direction currently?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I probably have should have started with a disclaimer. I'm sure I said the word women a number of times, and we are trying really hard to acknowledge the fact that trans folks and non-binary folks also need reproductive health care and have a number of compounding barriers that make it really hard to access that care, not the least of which is when we constantly talk about reproductive health care by using words like women and women's health care. So apologies that I've perpetuated some of that myself just now. But yeah, I think we are, as a movement, doing a better job of understanding and assessing and responding to the needs that folks have. You know, when I was talking earlier about the Black maternal health crisis and some of the implicit biases that folks face in that context, it's also true in the context of reproductive health care, that trans and non-binary folks face a lot of implicit bias about what kinds of reproductive health care services they may or may not need. It often starts and stops with gender care that's like related to gender confirmation and that kind of stuff, without providers realizing the full scope of reproductive health care that folks in that community might need or want. So we just have to get better about our language, about how we frame these issues, about the trainings that we provide to healthcare providers, about the policy solutions that we craft to make sure that they're inclusive. And there are some great organizations leading the way in that space. And again, really centering those folks and making sure that they're at the core of the policy solutions and proposals that are advanced.
Thank you so much for that question. Our next question will come from Rachel Paul.
Hi, Shaina. You had mentioned at the beginning that you did some work in the research space and worked with researchers from other organizations, maybe from academic institutions. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that research usually looks like and how you collaborated with outside organizations.
Oh, did I say that I did research? I'm trying to think about some of the more like research type stuff that I've done. I mean, I think one of the things that's so important is we often do lack really good data about some of these issues that are presumed to primarily impact women. And so it's really critical to have good relationships with researchers at academic institutions and otherwise to help us gather that data and often like unpack the data and disaggregate it. You know, I think about my colleagues who do maternal health work say all the time, like, we know that Black women and Native women are disproportionately impacted. We don't have data to understand how the maternal health crisis is playing out in the lives of Asian American and Pacific Islander women. We just don't have it broken down in ways that help us make informed policy choices and develop informed solutions. So yeah, it's really essential to engage with researchers. I think researchers are another place that can be that really helpful point of connection between the direct services piece and the policy piece. Like folks that are doing really good, like participant-centered, oh, there's a word for it. I see Tim Bono on the screen. He probably knows. What is it? That community-based participatory research. I see other maybe research folks nodding. Thank you all for validating me. So folks that are doing that really good, like person-centered research, those are the folks that need to be our allies in the progressive policy space, because they've got a direct line to the folks who are most impacted. And then that data and the information that comes from that type of really good, like inclusive, collaborative, thoughtful research can be really impactful in terms of forming policy solutions. Sorry, you probably hearing my kids screaming in the background.
We love it. These are some fabulous questions. Don't forget, please keep them coming through the Zoom group chat. We'll go to a pre-submitted question from one of our guests. Jen Hartley, who's a Wooster graduate student, was very curious in knowing what you feel are the most impactful places to donate right now to support access to reproductive health care during COVID-19.
An excellent question. So folks may not know that there are something called abortion funds. They are in most states, and there's also an organization called the National Network of Abortion Funds that sort of serves as an umbrella for these organizations. And what they are places that help people with the really practical things that they need to access reproductive health care. Things like money to access that care if it's not covered by your insurance, which for most people it's not. Transportation. Most people have to travel long distances, often multiple states away, to access quality reproductive health care. So they need transportation, they might need a place to stay, a hotel or a motel, they might need childcare. So abortion funds provide all of that practical support that helps make access to reproductive health care meaningful for folks. So that's where I would spend my money right now.
All right, and we have another question that came from Candace Hayes, who's an undergraduate student. The question is, what resources are most scarce in DV shelters, crisis centers, and other agencies that serve survivors?
Yeah, I mean, this maybe is like a sort of a cop-out answer, but I think it's true. I think the scarcest resource is unrestricted funding and support. I will never forget, I was at an advocacy meeting with a director of a local domestic violence shelter. We were talking to her member of Congress in DC, and she pulled out a giant like Excel spreadsheet that she had taped together, and it was her budget. And every line was a different funding stream, you know, some state government grants, some federal government grants, some city grants, you know, some foundation and philanthropic grants. And every one of those, I think there were like, you know, 30 something line items. And every one of those funding sources was designated for a very narrow purpose. The one funding stream was maybe to provide some educational programming for children that live in the shelter. And another funding stream was to provide financial education to the women in the shelter. And, you know, it was like down to, you know, like so very specific. And programs need unrestricted funding that they can use in really adaptable, flexible ways to respond to the millions of needs that emerge that don't fit in a line on that Excel spreadsheet. So again, if you're in a position where you can make donations, I really encourage you, not just to domestic violence shelters. I would say this is probably true of all nonprofits. Like, give of your money freely and offer it without any limitations or specifications on how it can be used.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Let's see. It looks like Monica Sass has shared a link with everybody in the group chat, just for, looks like it's a resource. If you're looking to, for additional information, you can find more at that. Looks like it's a nonprofit link right there. So thank you, Monica, for sharing that. And again, feel free, if you do have questions for our featured speaker, Ms. Shaina Goodman, please submit your questions via the group chat. Let's see, another pre-submitted question that you may have touched on more, but maybe this is an opportunity to elaborate additionally, is how can we as a community most effectively advocate for rights of survivors during a crisis? So we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think what's happening right now is both at the federal and the state level, like federal legislators and governors in the states are moving so fast to kind of stop the bleeding or respond to what feels like the most emergent needs. And I think one of the things that we know from the history of policymaking is that when you do that, the folks who are most marginalized and the folks who are most struggling are often the ones who get left behind. And we're seeing that play out in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, and in a lot of other cases, folks with disabilities, homeless folks. I think across a range of issues, we're seeing that as Congress is working really quickly to try and legislate our way through this crisis, some folks' needs are just not getting met. So I think what we can do is be the forcing agent that asks our elected officials to pause and to say, wait a second, before you jump into the next like crisis response marathon legislating where you put together a 400-page bill in 24 hours, like, have you thought about what survivors need in this moment? Can we take one extra day and make sure that those issues are being responded to? And we all have that power to like call on our elected folks and make sure that they hear from us about the issues and the people that we care most about and we want to see centered in the next round of policy to respond to this crisis. And I think the unfortunate reality is there are going to be repeated bites at the apple as we keep trying to respond through policy to the COVID pandemic. And so there are lots of opportunities for us to say, wait a second, these folks need to be considered. And it's on all of us to make sure that that happens.
That's good. Thank you. And I guess we've got time for one more question. This is more of a career pathway and trajectory question from one of our undergraduate students, Miss Emily Stegmeyer. But she was very curious in knowing why you decided to go to law school, and how did your law degree, how was it useful in creating positive social change?
Sure. I think I touched on this briefly. Like for me, I thought, well, if I want to be in a courtroom advocating on behalf of survivors, I kind of need a law degree to do that. So it made sense for a lot of ways. But I do think the law is really powerful and often kind of an invisible force in our lives. Like unless you stop to think about it or had kind of a direct experience in one way or another, like it can often seem, the law can kind of seem invisible, and we don't realize the way that it impacts our day-to-day. And so I wanted to unpack all of that and like dig into that. And it turns out that like law and policy shapes literally everything. And so, you know, in terms of using it or understanding it as a vehicle for social change, like that's really it. And I think, you know, having a law degree is not, in my experience at least, necessary to be a great policy advocate. I think what it's done has helped me with a way of thinking. Like anybody who's been through law school will tell you, it teaches you a very particular way of thinking and of problem solving. And so that's not to say that that's not a skill set you can get elsewhere, but it's been really helpful for me to have that training and as I approach problems. And it just teaches you like how to spot issues, how to analyze things really critically, ask a lot of questions, try and unpack something. I can read a regulation a lot faster than some of my colleagues who haven't been to law school. Like some of it's just the practical stuff of like being able to understand, because it's like a different language. And so you kind of, law school helped me get more fluent in that language faster. And I think, you know, helps in terms of, like that skill set for how do I unpack this and think through really critically, like how this can play out in someone's lives, and what are the gaps, what are the barriers that folks might run up against when this law or policy gets played out on the ground and in the real world. So that's how I use my law degree. Also, like, it's helpful in some spaces to have a JD after your name. That's just the reality of like working in DC, and I want to be transparent about that too. Like, but I like love the fact that I'm a social worker, and I carry that with me just as much, if not more so, than my identity as a lawyer.
I love it. That's fabulous. Well, let's see. I'm going to take a look at the chat room, see if there's any more questions we missed. It looks like we haven't. So we'll offer one final opportunity for questions. And if there's no questions for our amazing speaker, featured speaker, Ms. Shaina Goodman, just want to say how much we really appreciate you for joining us today. And to our participants that are here with us, I'm going to share my screen one more time for you. And as we conclude today's session, just a couple of things to be mindful of. Let's see here. And we'll try to do it the right way, I promise. Let's see, and I hope you guys can all see the final screen share today. But we do invite you to take a moment to complete our survey via this QR code that I hope that is on your screens right now. And that will link you to a very brief survey that allows us to get some feedback from our Meet the Leader series. And we would love to hear from you. So all you have to do is just take out your cell phone if you have that with you or nearby, and take a picture of the QR code, and again, it will take you directly to our survey. If you have any additional questions, we encourage you to join us or visit us at our website at www.gephartinstitute.wusu.edu, or you can send us an email. We will be planning some additional Meet the Leaders series in the future, so we hope that you will stay tuned and follow us on our website for more information about the Meet the Leaders series. And again, we'd like to thank our amazing and dynamic speaker, Ms. Shaina Goodman, for joining us today. What a dynamic presentation you shared with us. Lots of insightful information about what you do and how you do it. And for those that are interested in staying with us, 2 o'clock ends our formal time with Shaina, but if you'd like to stick around with us, I hope that she's able to answer a few of your questions before she has to leave with us today. And again, we thank you for joining us. We encourage you all to be well, be healthy, and to stay engaged. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.